Hey everyone, so now we'll pass on to our next artist. Joshua Schwebel is a Canadian conceptual artist who has been active for over 10 years. Through his work, he reflects on the flows and motives of the labor and business of art, focusing on the exploitations and expropriations that produce artistic value. His work has been presented in exhibitions, events, and interventions across Canada and internationally, and has received support from the Conseil des Arts de Lettres du Québec and the Canada Council for the Arts. And I will let Joshua take it away. As I slide out of frame.
Hello, thank you for coming on this lovely pandemic Saturday. I have to extend my most grateful thanks to Centre Clark and to the community here in Montreal who have been so generous by telling me stories and helping me orient this project. As somebody who lived in the Myland almost 20 years ago, and for quite a few years, when I came back to start this project, I had a sense of what I wanted to work on. I wanted to work on gentrification, I wanted to work on the Pied Carré project, and I wanted to work on this building, and to understand and to unpack what changed in this building and what role we as an arts community played in those changes. And as in much of my work, my interest is sort of looking at processes and looking at economics, looking at value exchange, who is producing value and who is taking from that, who is profiting. And that interest comes a lot from having an artistic practice that is fairly anti-commercial. I have spent most of my practice not making objects or making things that frustrate the sale of art. I'm interested in stealing. I'm interested in nothing. I'm interested in ways that art can frustrate its own instrumentalization. Because I think that art is fundamentally, at least for me, about an other to or an outside of economic circulation or economic profit. I think of it as being a way of as getting outside of these kinds of exchanges where it's like you get a thing, you pay for the thing that you get, like there's a one-to-one relationship, and art produces other types of exchanges. So in some ways, seeing a space like this building, which had a non-economic function or a non-economic community, a community of artists living in here and working in here, where the rent was affordable and where people could exchange ideas and pursue their own interests, and seeing how that has been changed into a space of commerce and a space of business and a space where art becomes aesthetic instead of becoming exploration. Like all of those things sort of informed my value system coming into this investigation. But I wanted to see if that was what happened. And I was really, really lucky that people brought me in, that people trusted me, that people were willing to tell me more specifically than my own instincts what happened. And then my job was simply to take those stories and to find a form, to find material traces, to work with the artifacts and the residue of that. So each of the sort of, stations of the work trace a different trajectory of these exchanges. So behind you is a collection of detritus that I collected from Chabanel. The general history that I start that is at the base of all of this is sort of like the displacement of labor by artists, and then the displacement of artists by capitalism or creative entrepreneurship. And so the initial space of Clark was downtown at Clark in Ontario, which was initially also a garment district. Clark was evicted from that space the people who evicted him were, as Mathieu Beauséjour says in the audio interviews that I took with him, which you can't hear right now, but which are available by QR code, or you can listen to it later. He talks about how the literal goons came and evicted people with violence or with the threat of violence. And so they came here, and when they came here, there was nothing. It was the remains of the garment industry that were slowly moving up to Chabanel as newer buildings became available. And then with 2011, when this building was bought by Allied, which is a major national real estate trust, whose business is, on the one hand, buying underutilized spaces and what do they call it? Like extracting greater profit is what they don't call it, but it's what they do. Hype or something, I don't know the language, but they're basically renovating, raising the rents, and marketing this sort of creative use space to software developers, to startups, and just like insurance companies, et cetera, Ubisoft, all of that. So a lot of the garment industry moved further north to Chabanel, and as this building got more expensive, the artists have gradually also been moving and dispersing out of this building. Now, what came in between that, as most of you know, is the Pied Carré project, which was an association of artists who really mobilized to try to preserve some space in the Mile End and in this building for artists to use, and that meant that they needed to keep the space affordable. However, in the negotiations with Allied, what ended up going down was that first Allied was forced to keep the spaces affordable by way of a city bylaw that was enacted by Richard Ryan for the Borough Plateau Montréal. But then they renovated the space to such an extent that the city taxes went up so high that the spaces were no longer actually affordable. On top of that, a whole bunch of business people started coming to the Mile End to work because these spaces became available, which drove up the property value of the neighborhood. And gradually, other studio spaces in the last 7-8 years since the purchase of this building have been evicted, like the Bellechasse building, like several others that Catherine mentions in her interview. So artists found their way up to Chabanel. And now in the last 2-3 years, I've been coming here and researching what's happening at Chabanel. And just sort of as Chabanel's taking over floors in that building, I've been storing and collecting detritus from moving, like the garment industry that's there, moving out of there. So back to that side. This side is stuff that has been collected, that I collected with the help of another artist in the building of detritus that was found in Chabanel. And then I invited 9 artists who once had studios here and have since moved up to Chabanel. And each of them joined me in a walking procession to bring those by foot back to this building. So on Sunday, we did an action of dragging and pushing these things to the gallery. And I'm very grateful to those 9 artists for joining me on that walk. It was not public, but it was in order to sort of draw that connection, that line from one building to the other building with these materials, and to load these materials with that very specific significance. In general, with this project, I've been trying to use the people who have already been involved in this situation and this story to become the fabricators of what is in the work, in the show. Another actor in this show who's featured more on this side is Martin Schopp, who's the current president of Pied Carré. In the 10 years since the Pied Carré deal was struck, the association has gone in debt over $2 million to Allied. All of this is like recorded on these plaques. There are many reasons for that, some of which were told to me, some of which were not. In the last few months, however, Martin negotiated with Allied because in order to avoid going bankrupt, they took out a line of credit from Allied directly. And then in the last few months, they gave back one of the floors that they fought to preserve in this building in order to cancel out their debt. So now Pied Carré doesn't have a debt, but we've only saved 2 floors of this building of the original 4. 3? There's 3 out of 4 now. Okay. So it's like floor 3, 4, 5, and they gave back floor 2.
That sounds good.
Okay.
Well, 6 is part of it.
Hmm?
We're on the 6, so 6 is part of it. So.
Okay. I'm not like.
Yeah.
So, as a reflection of Pied Carré's role as a mediator, I asked Martin to build the framing structures that are in this exhibit. So each of the sort of like wooden elements are positioned as supports of the artifacts, and they're all built by Martin, both because he is a professional framer in his artisanal practice, but also because as a way of sort of formalizing the relationship between Pied Carré and Allied and the artists and the building. Sorry, I'm not moving.
No,
I'm not moving.
you can be there for sure.
This is a Monopoly set that was given to Clark and to other tenants by Allied, the landlord, to celebrate their acquisition of the property. It features Allied's properties on the game board and their CEO on its money.
You can flip it around if you want.
No, people can walk around later. It's okay. I didn't make it. It's real. And
A lot of people are like, what?
it was, I think Roxanne showed it to me in the archives when I was starting my research, because I was just like, tell me what's going on. I did visit Allied's office in Toronto, and while I was there, I went there with the express purpose of stealing something. Organizing. So I was really interested, on the one hand, in the movement of artists and how we're dispersed as a community and how that knowledge is lost. But then on the other hand, I discovered through my research that Allied has been sort of marketing itself since 2011, since the sort of change, since it was forced to include artists in its building, in this building. Allied started marketing itself as a creative landlord. Their PR firm only began to exist as a PR firm in 2011, and it is led by the CEO's wife. Their PR campaign, which was entirely founded on not wanting to look like they lost to a group of artists, included a press release called Make Room for the Arts, which is literally an empty press release. It is a Yahoo post that just says, Allied announces its Make Room for the Arts program. There's nothing there at all. And I went to them to try to talk about it, to be like, what exactly is this? How are you putting this into practice? And I just got a bunch of runaround. Ultimately, I finally did talk to someone, but she was just like, yes, we do 1% projects, and we have the Pied Carré project, and that's it. And and it's like, we like artists because it's a win-win for us. We don't want to be gentrifiers. So there's that. Then the other part of their campaign is this Block magazine. Block magazine is available free in the lobbies of Allied's buildings. And what I found super perverse about it is that it features artists, articles about artists with established arts writers who write for Canadian art, who write for like reputable arts publications. in their like it is an advertisement for Allied. It's in their spaces, and it's the tagline of it is like, creativity has its place. So there's this weird sort of opportunizing on creativity and what artists do in order to market them, and to reaffirm this kind of PR lie that they are actively supporting us, when actually they have actively displaced us. And it puts artists in this weird position, because we accept to participate in this magazine because they pay really well. And yet, ultimately, we still don't have the power to define either how we're represented or where we're able to work, because there is not any space where it's very difficult to find affordable space when you're not making a profit and when you're not participating in capitalism. So, finally, when I visited their offices with the intent to steal, and sort of like using the tell me about the Big Room for the Arts program as a front, I did take this photo, which is outside of their window from their office. Their office in Toronto is in the garment industry, former garment industry. It's built directly above a former factory. It's like a brick building that has a giant glass tower sitting directly on top of it. And the brick sort of serves this backdrop of like, look at how beautiful the residue of manual labor is. Look at this aesthetic. Look at how real we are. And in their reception area, they had this pile of books. Many of these books are art books, Edward Bertinsky books. Then they have books about architecture. They have books about urbanism. And then finally, the book that was on the top is this book by Jane Jacobs, which is sort of about how art and culture are important for vital cities. But they're using it as a way of saying, like, we are part of the creative industry and part of what is vitalizing our cities, which is so untrue. And it's so much a part of their recycling of the work of artists into their own image that I find really objectionable. So I stole the cover as a way of sort of like stripping off the facade, and then I left. So other than that, I did ask Joe Flatt, who is the VP of Allied's she's newly hired there in 2020, and she was responsible for the Make Room for the Arts program, aka like when I contacted them, the CEO put me in touch with her. And I did ask her to take this photo outside the office with her cell phone, and she would not. It's not a big deal, but it's just sort of a little prod to be like, how do you put your making room for the arts or your support of the arts into practice? Clearly not by supporting artists. Have I missed anything? I sort of missed the entrepreneurial, creative city part of the City of Montreal's development policy, but that's a big one. The panels? Okay. So these panels are reproductions of the panels that Allied actually uses as their like display stanchions to display communication with tenants. This is where I sort of put all of my research, my email correspondence. I made 4 different sort of themes on the panels. One is the Allied panel, which is sort of communications from and with Allied. This one is Clark, and Clark's relationship to Ubisoft in their APO, the Atelier Porte Ouverte, and the sponsorship of Clark's events by Allied, by Ubisoft, sorry. And also the negotiations around the signage for the plaques. The plaques. So I got these plaques engraved. Some of you may have noticed coming in through that side that the entire corridor of the building is lined with plaques that are very similar, that are used to sort of credit Allied and the government of Quebec or different funders. So there are ways of recognizing sponsorship, and they're attached to the architecture of the building. So I wanted to use that vocabulary as a way of sort of referencing that the role of sponsorship and the need to mention or to publicize these sponsors in our spaces or on the outside of our spaces, on the margins. So these do provide the narrative description and the specificity for the work, but they're also very specific in terms of their material vocabulary. So the other notations on this panel are about the negotiations of what goes on the plaque with the pôle culturel, which is the regroupement of different artist-run centers that came into the building when Picaré, 2011. Sorry, this is hard to like do in a short period of time. I'm really disorganized, sorry. So on this panel facing me here, that you cannot see, is the city. And so this panel deals with the city's sort of shift from having a cultural policy to having more of a creative entrepreneur policy, which is something they did around 2015, 2016, 2017, and continue to do. That can be seen in the way that the Calc is offering so much money for digital creative practices, numérique. The Canada Council also, and if you look at Canada's cultural policy, it's now become a creative policy. I find that super fucked because it also indicates a shift from art to entrepreneur. It shifts us, it allows more digital design, digital entrepreneur, game design, all of those creative industries who have a very different class, a different sort of income structure, different access to income to be a part of this, and it's all part of this neoliberalization of what we're doing. So that's embedded in the city's sort of like shift as well of language. And then one of the things I found online that was super interesting is like there was a conference, a piloting committee that met to develop this cultural policy, and one of the axes that they had was around financing. And I found the CEO of Allied as one of the people giving a presentation in this advice to the city on how to develop a cultural policy, or not a creative industry policy or an entrepreneurship policy. And so I included his speech and some photos of the city and the directors of artist-run centers in the building when the sort of celebration of this building being what it has become inaugurated. So then, and I also reached out to Michel Picard, who was involved with the city on the cultural committees and was involved in the negotiations of Picaré. I asked if she would be willing to trace or to redraw the book cover that I stole from Allied's office. Again, as a way of sort of formally representing the relationship between the city and Allied and the city and Allied's representation of themselves. She refused. Kindly, but she said she couldn't, and then on the other side of this panel is, what is it? It's Picaré, yeah?
Picaré.
So this one is more about Picaré, the negotiations, and
The signed petition also.
yes, and just sort of like, again, like the names of the people who are involved, and you can see that the same people are echoing throughout, just as the same sort of waves of gentrification are causing the same processes of displacement over and over and over again. And the final element is the audio, which is silent right now so that you can hear me. But I have interviews with 3 artists, and I think it's really important to hear the artists' voices in this case, telling it from a first-person perspective, because we don't hear that. We see the way that these things are represented through the press or through the city or through policy, but it's very different to see it regrouped around an artist's perspective and what effect that has had on the neighborhood, what effect that has had on the center of the gallery, the community. So the 3 artists who've been generous enough to speak with me are Catherine Bodmer, Mathieu Beauséjour, who was the former director of Clark when all of this was going down, and also the former director of Picaré, And then, or I got the titles wrong, I'm sorry. And then finally, Celia Perrin-Sidarus, who's an artist who participated in a block magazine, Centerfold, and once had a studio here, and then moved up to Chabanel, and she also participated in the procession. So I think, I'm sure I'm missing everything, but questions are good.
The curtain, also the repurposing of the curtain.
Thank you. Yeah, at the end of the show, the curtain is going to be used as a dividing curtain in between exhibits, so it'll go on the window facing the corridor, as a way of also mirroring back Allied's view to the people in the interior exterior space of the building. Ready? Questions? Help me focus too. Yes.
The question which really comes up for me is, do you think artists are not radical enough? And maybe to contextualize it a bit, like I have a few pied carrés up at Pied Carré here, not that many. And I'm here since 2014, and when it became obvious that like the deal with Allied wasn't really a good deal, the way it was advertised, I mean, there were discussions kind of like, okay, should they stop paying rent? They kind of make something really political out of it, like what would happen. And I mean, at the end, a lot of kind of like people simply left. Like, I mean, that's kind of like what happened. And I was kind of, personally, I was a little bit surprised. So my question is kind of like, what do you think about, like, should artists be more radical?
Of course, I think artists should be. I think artists should be more radical, but it's not like, it's so complicated, right? Because we're not, like one thing that Catherine says that really touches me, all of this work is not paid. To fight and to stay, it takes a huge emotional toll. It's traumatic. You're fighting for a space that you've occupied for decades in a community that is feeding your practice, and it's not paid. And so, of course, we should be more radical, but it's easier to be radical when you have affordable space, when you're not exhausted trying to work to support your practice in order to get the energy you need to fight. So I think that it's a very compromised position, and I think we're, unfortunately, because capitalism has caught up with all of the sort of loopholes that we had available to us in the 60s and 70s, where we were able to sort of occupy these dead zones, and now these dead zones have been revitalized and they're harder and harder to find. So it's like, I wish we could be more radical, but I think being radical is a privilege, or it's also, we're exhausted, you know? Like, it's not, the thing that I really wanted to achieve with this show, as opposed to much of my other work where it has a more like one-to-one confrontation, is that this is really imbricated, it's really embedded. Every single person is compromised, every person is doing their best. They're not, like, except maybe Allied, I think they're fucking evil. But like, I think that as artists and as community members and as even like with Pied Carré, they're not trying to fail, but there's only so much they can do given the arrangement they have to make and the deals that they have to make to survive. And I don't know, like, it's sad that artists left, but it makes sense. It wasn't affordable anymore. It's not an artist space anymore, aside from like Clark and aside from the artist-run centers. Like, the community space that it was, where it had this kind of autonomy, it's not in this building anymore. Is that fair?
Yeah. I mean, I was just curious a bit what your position is, maybe more explicit. I mean, you said implicit here, and but I do also think kind of like things are kind of like intertwined. You can't like kind of like this complicity. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, if you work as an artist in the city, you make all kinds of deals on a daily basis, right? Like,
of course,
to stay afloat. So the question is more like a little bit sometimes where to draw the line, how far you go. So that's
and I think there's a lot of pressure right now. Like, if you consider, even within artist-run culture, like, there's a requirement not to have like a certain percentage of your income coming from fundraising and coming from non-council sources, which constrains how much autonomy there can be. And that's in my opinion, a real degradation of what artist run culture should be. Like, I think it should be fully funded and well funded, and that labor should, like, that artistic labor and the labor of cultural work should be paid adequately. And right now people are just paid part-time and are working way over what they're paid. So I think in all these ways people are exhausted and compromised, and it makes for a system that can't demand things, but it has to be grateful. Yeah.
I guess, yeah, my question is kind of like just a different way of unfolding Tomas's question, because, like, I think Tomas, myself, some other people here in the room were deeply involved in this. It's very hard for us to be objective.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at you and I'm thinking, oh, here's somebody who could approach this perhaps more objectively. So I guess I'm looking like maybe for like a diagnostic or like a recommendation for the future. Like, if we look at this as kind of like a rise and fall of a utopia, like, what could we do next time that would make it sustainable, that would keep it from falling? Do you have a sense of things that could have been done differently or better?
Oh God, I don't know. I mean, I'm just an artist too, right? And I'm very not objective. Like, I'm not an objective person.
He is not, yeah.
I care too much. And I think that this show is very nostalgic. It's not like nostalgic couched in a very, like, you know, an aesthetic, but still. It's hard to say, right? I think that the city, I think that the answer is to push the city harder to preserve spaces and to own spaces and to give own spaces to artists. That takes a collective lobbying. Yes,
please,
Patrimoine, you are actually a real expert in
Well,
this.
it's just because, no, not at all. But I was just really, like many other people, active in this fight. And I think the most radical thing I can think of is probably to squat. You know, and we talked about that, and that's just not so much a practice that is like rooted in this, I guess, North American context. But it's very was, and maybe not so much anymore, but was still very alive in the European context. And the city, the relationship with I didn't study it at all, but it was just interesting to see that it's kind of a claiming of a space. Artists would just go into empty spaces, and after a while city had to negotiate, and often, not always at all, but oftentimes there was some kind of project coming out of it where a relative autonomy was granted to artists collectives. So that's when you ask for radical, and I think of something like that, where in fact the cities play a big role in it, because they ultimately can protect these spaces.
I think I agree. Like, I think that even though I say that the city, I don't think that city is going to do anything for us. I think we as a community have to collectively demand and take space. And I think I've been living in Berlin for the last few years, and a lot of the the squats that have been there for 30, 40 years are getting evicted right now. Violently evicted, and houses that of 50 people are just, it's a little tiny war against the police and against the building's owner who suddenly show up. And I think squatting is a really good answer, but it's like hard to find those spaces, and it takes a lot of collective work. It's tough for artists to do things collectively, but I think it's also what's really necessary.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned collectivity, because I'm looking at ally. Ally. I'm thinking about alliances, and I'm thinking about allyship. And from my perspective, like, one of the big failures in the project was a lack of an alliance between Atelier Créatif, cadre, and the individual artists and artist organizations that were here.
It's funny.
And often there was a sense that the artists were fighting against cadre, and you'd have to put them aside and go like, no, look, these are actually the people that we have to ally with in order to create a common front, and we shouldn't be destabilizing this organization and creating like a $2 million debt for them.
And that's what's so frustrating about it, is that artists are like so notoriously hard to collectivize, because like, all of our lives we've just fought for autonomy. That is the raison d'etre of our practice, is like autonomy. And then it's like, no, we have to work together, and we have to have a organized way of proceeding, because it's urgent.
So balancing collectivity with radical activity is the
I mean, I don't think that those are exclusive, but I
No,
think for
no.
artists they are.
Yeah.
Because we don't like structure or leadership or yeah. And not to generalize, because some artists really do like those things.
I mean, one interesting thing is like this spring there was this big discussion about empty storefronts in the Maryland. I mean, a very simple solution to have them not
Yeah.
empty anymore.
But they're all owned by Schiller Levy, so there's like really very little of a chance to do anything about them, because they want them empty. They'd
But
rather.
I guess the question, of course, kind of changing the law. It's kind of like, okay, I mean, if they're empty for more than a year, maybe
Yeah.
we should start moving in.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it's very simple. And maybe then they wouldn't be empty. I mean, it's kind of like it would change something, right? But that's of course would need quite a change. There's property rights and stuff. So.
But I don't have a do this kind of solution at all. I just see like this particular story, which is a story that I do care a lot about. Because I always sort of see my land and see Montreal as like my home, and where I would like to return to, and to see how much it's changed, and how it's not a refuge anymore because it's not affordable. Is really scary for me, just on a personal level, and that's why I was like, what happened? Like, and then I kept finding it was so complicated, and there were so many different interest groups and so many different hopes and disappointments, that it just became more and more important to me to get it right. Artistically, I tried in some gestures to figure out like, what can I do? And I was like, I don't think I can do anything, like as an artist.
I disagree.
What do you?
Like there's some-
Oh,
I think that the practical questions, these questions are very, very, the most important questions. I was wondering if you could say a bit though about, I mean, when this started out, it was what you called a dead area, a dead piece of property.
Right.
It was undoubtedly the presence of these numbers of artists with their individual practices who added value to this piece of land, this piece of property. And it was somebody other than the artists who extracted that monetary value, or that value in a monetary form. I was wondering if you could just say something about that movement. What is it? How do the artists add value to a neighborhood, to a property? How is it that somebody else is able to extract that value? And take away what's most valuable about the property to the artists themselves. Great question.
Too much sighing.
how do artists add value? I think, again, it's this sort of alternate or parallel economy of recuperating, of working with turning like garbage into practice, of working in spaces where nobody else really wants to be, and then bringing cafes and bringing food and bringing plants and bringing sunlight and life. And I think all of those things are just, artists' working spaces sort of are just gentle and find little treasures in spaces. I don't really have I don't know. But we don't own the spaces usually. And so that work that we put in is given. It's not, it's an investment, but it's not, it doesn't have any legal status. And that's really, it's disappointing because it exists as though capitalism doesn't exist. And then eventually capitalism notices it. And Mathieu Beauséjour told me this story about one of the ateliers portes ouvertes that he felt sick after because all of a sudden people came to look at the artist studios in the Mile End and they were commenting on the real estate value and the view and the proximity to the metro. And he was like, fuck, we've been discovered.
Double-edged sword.
And then, of course, the people who can buy things will buy them. And I think it's inevitable because we don't have those protections in place. That other people start to see that value and start to insert it into a market commodity exchange. But I don't know. Again, I don't know what to do about it. Catherine, what were you going to say?
No, I was just reacting, what can we do as artists? And,
Oh, yeah.
yeah. But then, because I feel like we still can continue to make noise, and I
Yeah.
think that if we step out a little bit of the bubble also, and address directly to the deciders, people who have the media is very useful. They help immensely to bring like changes into work, and but there's still so much more work to do. But on a legislation level, but I feel like this is just also a question of keep harassing.
Yeah. And I think what I meant by saying there's nothing I can do, what I meant was like, in this configuration of this exhibit, I was like, what can I do? And then I was like, why do I need to do this big performative grand gesture for my show? It's not my, like I wanted to sort of show it in a more respectful way than being like, how can I fix this? And that's what I was like not doing, and saying like, I as an artist, in the role of artist, in the role of an art show, there's not a thing I can do to fix it. Because sometimes in my work I do these like gestures, economic gestures to make a thing exist or make a thing change, but there wasn't a thing, like a gesture, a process that I could do to revolve.
Well, the show's the thing.
The show,
Shining light on this thing, and that can create change, because it can create noise.
It's making noise
Yeah,
in the way
exactly.
that Catherine's talking about.
But it would be interesting to have the city people look at it.
very, it would be.
Yeah, so that maybe there's a reaching out.
Yeah, that's gonna be a good conversation to be had.
No, but I
It's an incredible show. I think it's really, really great to, memorialize the rise and fall of this utopia. I really like to sort of show the contingent parts and like what went wrong, and really draw attention to Allied and like this is an incredibly cynical
This one.
gesture. And just to frame it, I think is incredibly resonant.
I think it's like just what you're kind of showcasing. It's kind of like a global thing. It's a very like I can really like map this positioning in many things that we're like becoming like I can maybe do this gest, but like in regards, let's say with vaccines, like they're like the gray area, like about like our reaction to what's happening in the world. Like it's kind of in a very similar thing. Like we're witnessing things are happening, but alternatives are not there. And this is very different than, let's say, like 70s, 60s, like where there are movements and then like there are ideas of like doing this, but we're all becoming like, oh. So it's just maybe the time for observation and just continue to be, and then maybe the phase will pass and new alternatives will come.
I mean, I think that there was something I was thinking of, and I don't know if it directly connects to what you were just saying, but I want to say it anyway, which is that sort of like my work is really engaged in like looking at infrastructure and margins and systems around art, not so much putting a thing in a space that has my name on it. And so I think that making this work hyper local and hyper specific about the building and the gallery's placement in the building and the artist's relationship to the building makes it relevant also to other situations that are parallel or similar. I have been working on this subject of gentrification through art for a few years now, and it's something I'm really interested in amongst other aspects of institutional critique, just because I think it's like, what do galleries do? What does art do? I feel really excited about this work and also about this exhibit, because I feel like it's actually the most accessible work I've ever done. So yeah, I don't know. Other questions or comments?
I actually think that's a great place to end off, but thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.